A Maasai warrior raises his shield in battle, and encoded on its surface is the precise hour of the day, the political constitution of an entire realm, and a map of the solar calendar stretching across the African Rift Valley. That is not a metaphor. That is the argument. Welcome to Co-Pilot Podcasts. Today we are pulling apart one of the most audacious claims in the study of ancient history, that solar and lunar cycles were not merely observed by archaic peoples, but were the operating system of their governments, their calendars, and their writing. By the end of this episode, you will understand what iconographic writing actually is, how the sun and moon were embedded into objects we have been calling art for centuries, and why the celestial and terrestrial nobility of the archaic world may have left their fingerprints on institutions we still use today. I am joined by someone who has spent considerable time with this research. What on earth is iconographic writing, and why should anyone care?
So the research, published under the name "An Unknown Soldier," makes a very specific and rather startling claim. It argues that there exists a writing system, a genuine system with rules of syntax and compositional grammar that was in widespread use across every continent before modern academia agrees that literate civilization even existed. And crucially, this system does not modulate verbal information the way alphabets do. It modulates visual information. The author calls it iconographic writing.
So not hieroglyphics, not cuneiform, something older and, the research claims, more global.
Precisely. And the research is careful to distinguish it from pictographic writing. Egyptian hieroglyphics, the author argues, were actually an innovation on top of this older system. Egypt, as he puts it, upgraded to Twitter while her neighbors remained with conventional mail. The underlying system, though, persisted globally, and what it was primarily documenting, in composition after composition, was the structure and function of archaic realms, their nobility, their political courts, their territorial boundaries. And the primary organizing framework for all of that was celestial. It was the sun and the moon.
Right, but, and I want to push on this straight away, ancient people tracking the sun is not exactly a revelation, is it? Stonehenge, the pyramids, we know this. What makes this research different?
That is exactly the right question, and it is where the research becomes genuinely surprising. The argument is not simply that ancient people observed the sun. The argument is that the solar and lunar cycles were the literal operating calendar of governance. The king's physical location throughout the year, where he was, which court he was attending, which kingdom he was presiding over, was readable by any subject simply by knowing where the sun was in the sky at that moment. The shield was not decorative. It was a real-time political directory.
That is a remarkable claim. Walk me through the Maasai shield specifically, because the research goes into extraordinary detail on that.
So the Maasai Regalia shield, and the research is very specific that this is a royal arms dominion, not just any shield, is composed in black, white, and red, which the author identifies as the chromatic signature of an apex composition in this iconographic idiom. The central element of the shield is what the research calls a solar arc. And the convention is that the top of any composition always represents east. So the arc documents the sun's daily progress, from dawn at the top to dusk at the bottom.
And the diamonds along the arc, those are hours?
Yes. Each diamond represents an hourly increment. Half diamonds mark dawn and dusk. Noon is split by what the research describes as an elaborate royal X icon. And when you count the diamonds, you arrive at 10 hours of daylight between dawn and dusk, which the author reconciles with the practical reality of the African Rift Valley, where the surrounding mountain ranges mean that sunrise and sunset, in the geophysical sense, are not the same as the locally observed first and last light. The research is insistent on this point. Iconographic writing is a practical science grounded in local perspective, not universal orthodoxy.
So the shield is not recording an abstract astronomical truth. It is recording what the sun actually looked like from a specific place.
Exactly. And that local specificity is actually one of the research's most powerful analytical tools, because it means that deviations from a standard composition can be used to infer the latitude of the observer. Every realm's iconography carries implicit geographical coordinates. But returning to the shield, flanking the central solar arc are 4 additional arcs. 2 are the northern and southern maximal progressions, which correspond to what we would call the solstices, and 2 smaller arcs document the winter solar progress as observed from the southern and northern extents of the realm's territory.
So 5 arcs in total.
5 arcs, and the research draws a direct correlation between those 5 arcs and 5 planets, the 5 planets visible to the naked eye in the archaic world. Each arc corresponds to a prince of the realm. The sovereign's progress is always along the central solar arc. The Elder Council met in the morning, the sovereign's court convened for 2 hours either side of noon, and the heir apparent presided from noon until dusk. The shield, in other words, is a daily schedule, an annual calendar, and a political constitution simultaneously.
And then there is the spear.
Yes, and this is where it becomes almost playful. The research notes that the regalia spear, always carried alongside the shield, functioned as the needle on a sundial. The shield provided the calibrated arc, the spear cast the shadow. So a Maasai warrior standing in the field was, in effect, holding a precision timekeeping instrument. The author's phrase is rather good. Spoiler alert, the Maasai were doing more than chucking spears.
Ha! I love that. But let us go deeper, because the research does not stop at the Maasai. It makes a much larger claim about what all of this iconography was actually encoding, and that is where the celestial and terrestrial nobility comes in.
Right, and this is, I think, the conceptual heart of the research. The author argues that every archaic realm had 2 distinct castes of nobility. The celestial nobility were those whose stations were inherited, passed from parent to child, regarded as eternal, as divinely ordained. The terrestrial nobility, by contrast, were appointed or elected by the celestial nobility. Their honors and titles did not pass to their children. They were regarded as mortal in the sense that their authority died with them.
And the iconographic writing system was encoding both of these simultaneously.
In every composition, the sun represented the celestial father, the inherited, eternal, divine, masculine principle. The moon represented the celestial mother. And the research is unambiguous on this. There is, as the author puts it, absolutely no confusion on the subject in any realm of the archaic world. The sun is the celestial father, the moon is the celestial mother. Full stop.
Now, and I want to be honest here, when I first read that, my instinct was to file it under interesting mythology. But the research is making a much more structural claim than that, isn't it?
It is, because the research then traces this dual structure, celestial and terrestrial, inherited and appointed, conservative and progressive, forward in time. The author points directly to the Lord's spiritual and Lord's temporal in modern Britain. One deliberative body regarded as wiser, more conservative, more permanent. The other more progressive, more responsive, more mortal in its authority. And the democratic corollary, the research argues, is the United States Senate and House of Representatives. One body elevated, one body more impulsive. The research frames this as a direct institutional inheritance.
That is a genuinely striking connection. You are saying the House of Lords and the US Senate might be, in some structural sense, descendants of a governance system that was being encoded into Maasai shields and Norse brooches thousands of years ago.
That is precisely what the research argues. And the author is careful to frame it not as mysticism, but as institutional logic. All systems, he writes, are predicated on the need to elevate the wise and suppress the impulsive. The celestial nobility provided the conservative anchor. The terrestrial nobility provided the responsive mechanism. And the solar and lunar cycles were the clock by which the whole system ran.
Let us talk about the lunar side of this, because the research goes into remarkable detail on lunar iconography specifically, and it is quite different in character from the solar material.
It is. And the research makes a distinction that I find genuinely elegant. Solar iconography, broadly speaking, documents the male domain, the celestial father, the inherited patrilineal stations of the nobility, the daily and annual progress of the sovereign. Lunar iconography documents the female domain, and the metrics are different. Where solar iconography tends to operate in base 3 and base 5, lunar iconography operates in cycles of 9 and 11.
9 months of gestation.
Exactly. The research analyzes a Norse regalia brooch identified as a sovereign mother's brooch and counts 9 lunar stations in its composition. The author's conclusion is that this is not coincidence. The metrics and the iconography, he argues, guarantee this is documenting a feminine domain. And the generational metaphor is beautiful. Grandmothers are the waxing moon, mothers are the full moon, daughters are the waning moon. Baskets, the research notes, were a universal form of lunar iconography. The grandmother pours wisdom into the mother's basket, the daughter turns her basket upward to receive.
That is a remarkably coherent metaphor to find, encoded across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other.
And that is precisely the researcher's point. The same metaphor, the same compositional grammar, appears in Indonesia, Asia, the Americas, Polynesia, Australia, Arabia, Africa, and Europe. The research does not treat this as coincidence or as evidence of diffusion from a single source. It treats it as evidence of a shared information technology, one that was arrived at through the same process of astronomical observation and practical governance in every region of the world.
Now, the research also addresses the obvious tension. If you have a solar calendar and a lunar calendar running simultaneously, how do they synchronize? Because solar years and lunar months do not divide neatly.
Yes, and the answer the research proposes is found in the Norse brooch itself. The brooch features 4 gold arrows connecting the outer lunar stations to the central sovereign mother. Each arrowhead contains 3 red garnets, a captain and 2 lieutenants, in modern terms. 4 triads of royal guards. 4 times 3 is 12. And 12, the research argues, is how the solar calendar was synchronized to the lunar calendar. The author's phrase is rather precise. One might be more correct to call this an ecliptic calendar, as the solar calendar is implicit within the lunar calendar.
So the 12-month year is not an arbitrary convention, it is the mathematical resolution of the solar and lunar cycles as encoded in the regalia of the archaic nobility.
That is the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And the research goes further. It suggests there were never periods in history when only the solar or only the lunar calendar was followed. The two were always unified. Unity in duality, as the author repeatedly phrases it, is the governing principle of the entire iconographic system.
I want to bring in the Battersea Regalia helm at this point because it is one of the most detailed case studies in the research, and it connects the solar and lunar material in a way that I found genuinely astonishing.
So the Battersea Regalia helm, which is on display in the British Museum, is a bronze repousse helmet found in the River Thames, upriver from Westminster Bridge. The research dates it to the period between Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain and Claudius Augustus's invasion in 43 AD. And the iconography on the front of the helm is, the author argues, a complete ecliptic composition.
Meaning it documents both solar and lunar phenomena simultaneously.
Yes, the upper composition features 3 dominant solar disks, positioned precisely at the northern maximal, the central solar progress, and the southern maximal, exactly as the Maasai shield predicts. Associated with each solar disk are lunar disks and lunar crescents. The research's working hypothesis is that this documents the positional conjunctions of the moon in varying phases across the sun's annual solar progress. In other words, it is an astronomical dataset encoded in repousse bronze.
And the lower composition, that is where it gets extraordinary.
The lower composition threw the author for months, by his own account. He eventually identified it through a Gaelic lament called Tirnanog, a pre-Roman song about the celestial realm, the afterlife, and what the lyrics describe as the Celestial Father's great white ship. The research proposes that the lower composition on the Battersea helm is a rendering of the Milky Way. And when the author superimposed the linear composition onto a photograph of the Milky Way, he found, and I am quoting directly here, a nearly perfect proportional correlation, with the negative spaces in the Latene design corresponding precisely to dark patches and voids in the Milky Way.
So a pre-Roman British sovereign was wearing the Milky Way on his helmet.
That is the claim, and the research contextualizes it within the broader belief system of the archaic world, that outer space was regarded as a vast ocean, that stars were distant campfires maintained by kinsmen who had transcended the living world, and that the celestial father rode his golden chariot across the sky each day, gathering the souls of the recently departed at dawn and returning to his celestial ship at dusk. The Milky Way was the ship. The helm was a declaration of faith and a political document simultaneously.
Now, I have to raise something the research mentions almost in passing, because it is one of those details that sounds completely outlandish until you follow the logic. The Loch Ness Monster.
Yes. The research proposes, with what I think is genuine seriousness, that periodic sightings of the Loch Ness Monster can be attributed to ancient sunken vessels, longboats used as regalia arcs by the pre-Roman nobility that have recently bloated and surfaced. The chalk whitewash that once adorned these vessels has long since corroded, leaving only the prows, which bob briefly on the surface before releasing their gases and sinking again. The author estimates that if one longboat per year sank in Loch Ness since the earliest Norse peoples arrived, there could be over 26,000 hulls on the loch floor.
That is either the most creative explanation for a modern myth I have ever heard, or it is genuinely worth a marine archaeology expedition.
The research argues the latter, quite firmly, and it connects to a broader point that the iconographic record in the British Isles proves an established nobility employing this writing system were thriving, not merely surviving, in the region since the glacial maximum. The longboats, like the shields and the brooches and the helms, were constitutional documents. They were carved with the iconography of the realm they represented.
Let us talk about the Norse material more broadly, because the research makes a claim that I think will surprise people, that Norse iconography and Maasai iconography are not just similar in spirit, they are structurally identical.
Yes, the research analyzed a regalia brooch from Northern Europe. The author believes it to be from the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, or Sweden, and finds that despite the vast geographical and temporal distance from the Maasai, the compositional rules are identical. Rectangular gems document dawn, noon, and dusk. Diamonds identify each hour. The central element is an ecliptic iconograph. The author's conclusion is blunt. This is not art. This is language.
And Thor's hammer fits into this.
It does. The research identifies a stone regalia mace from Denmark dated to the Upper Paleolithic, around 8300 BC, as the progenitor of Thor's hammer. And the shape, the author argues, originates in the solar arc documentation. The bone-like form of the mace is the result of carving the solar progress into a material that naturally suggested that shape. The Norse were using the same information technology as the Maasai. Thor's hammer is a solar iconograph.
And the research extends this to Mayan iconography as well.
Yes, the author places a Mayan composition alongside the Norse material and notes there is little, if any, structural or functional difference between them. The research's explanation is that these compositions conform to language protocols and socio-political protocols which had achieved a global convention thousands of years before the humanities department, as he puts it, recognizes humans were capable of verbal expression.
Which brings us to the lunula of Regan, the Irish regalia necklace, because that is where the research gets into the most granular astronomical detail and where the claim about ecliptic data collection becomes almost vertiginous.
The lunula of Regan is a crescent-shaped regalia necklace in early Latène repousse, dated to around 2300 BC, the same period as Stonehenge and Newgrange. The research deconstructs it and finds, at its center, a solar array composed of 3 solar disks. The author's conclusion is that this documents the sun's meandering within a tight compass over a 3-year period. Specifically, the sun's position at the solar maximal recorded on the same day each year for 3 successive years.
So they were tracking the sun's drift over multiple years.
Yes, and the research proposes the method was remarkably simple: a camera obscura. A hole in the sunny side of a tent, a blank sheet of paper moved along the resulting beam of light until the sun came into crisp focus. The author calls this the incident of innovation. Over time, tracing the solar disk on the same day each year, the solar triad forms. 3 positions of the sun within a compass approximately as wide as the moon during an eclipse. That pattern, 3 suns within a lunar disk, became the foundational iconograph of the celestial father's face.
The face of God, as the research puts it, was discernible only after long, patient observation, meticulous recording, and thorough understanding of celestial phenomena.
Exactly. And that face, 2 upper solar disks forming the eyes, a lower solar disk forming the mouth pursed in a kiss, appears in archaic iconography from the British Isles to Africa, from Arabia to India, from Japan to Ecuador. The research calls it the surprised expression, and argues it is not a coincidence of aesthetic preference. It is the same astronomical observation made independently or in communication by scribes across the archaic world.
Now, the research also makes a claim about the Druids of Britain that I want to make sure we cover, because it reframes what we think we know about ancient British astronomy.
Yes, and this is one of the most technically detailed sections of the research. The author argues that the scribes of ancient Britain were not merely gathering astronomical data from a single location. They were operating a network of observatories, one in each of the 3 regnal courts of the realm. After every eclipse, all scribes sent their renderings to the central court, and the composite dateset, umbral, antumbral, and penumbral eclipse data combined produced the ecliptic array found on the lunula of Regan. The shape and attitude of each penumbra relative to the antumbra, the research argues, function as geographical coordinates. The locations of the observatories are encoded in the iconography.
So the lunula is simultaneously a piece of jewelry, a political document, and a record of a distributed astronomical observation network.
That is the argument. And the research notes that this was a staggering discovery for the author himself, not just that ancient scholars were astronomers, which we knew, but that we had never considered the datasets they were keeping, or the institutional infrastructure required to compile them. This was not one wise man watching the sky. This was a coordinated, multi-site scientific program.
And the Isle of Man sits at the center of all of this, in the researcher's account.
Yes. The research identifies the Isle of Man as the realm court of the archaic realm of Brethren, the central court from which the sovereign father and mother reigned for thousands of years prior to 9300 BC. The three-legged emblem on the Isle of Man's flag, the Triskelion, is, the author argues, a direct record of the sovereign's 3-year royal progress through the 3 kingdoms of the realm. Each leg of the Triskelion is a solar arc. The sovereign's court convened in each kingdom on a rotating basis, governed by the solar progress.
Which means the flag of the Isle of Man is, in the researcher's framework, a constitutional document.
As is, the research argues, every piece of regalia from every realm in the archaic world. The Maasai shield, the Norse brooch, the Battersea helm, the lunula of Regan, the Triskelion, all of them are constitutions. All of them are encoding the same dual structure, celestial nobility above, terrestrial nobility below, solar calendar governing the male domain, lunar calendar governing the female domain, and the ecliptic, the conjunction of sun and moon, as the moment of unity in duality.
I want to come back to the governance structure because I think it is the thread that ties everything together, and it is the part of the research that has the most direct relevance to how we think about institutions today.
So the research's argument about governance is built on what the author calls the base 3 metric. In any deliberative body composed of 3 constituents, deadlocks are impossible. The only time an arbiter overrules a court is to protect a minority. 3 votes cannot result in a stalemate. The research argues this is why the triad, 3 kingdoms, 3 princes, 3 solar arcs, dominates the iconographic record. It is not aesthetic preference. It is the most stable structure of government.
And when a 4th constituent is added, when the realm grows, the stability breaks.
The research is very precise about this. 4 constituents can deadlock. And because a deadlock guarantees the arbiter must intervene, the 4th eclipse, as the author calls it, mandates the arbiter expend political capital with every indecisive moment. The research argues it is during the 4th eclipse that political instability begins to erode the familial cohesion that once governed archaic realms. Yin and yang, as the author puts it, turn to fire and ice.
And the celestial and terrestrial distinction maps onto this. The celestial nobility providing the stable, conservative anchor, the terrestrial nobility providing the responsive, progressive mechanism.
Yes, and the research is explicit that this is not a system of elitist rule. The celestial nobility's authority was grounded in astronomical observation and practical governance. The sovereign's progress through the realm, trackable by any subject who could read the sun, was a form of radical transparency. The author's phrase is rather striking. In a day and age when government went to the people, not the other way around, political power did not concentrate in a centralized capital.
Which is a very different picture from the way we tend to imagine ancient monarchy.
Completely different. And the research argues that the modern inheritance of this structure, the Lords Spiritual and Lords Temporal, the Senate and the House, retains the essential logic even if the astronomical grounding has been lost. One body is conservative and elevated, regarded as wiser. The other is progressive and responsive, regarded as more impulsive. The research frames this as a direct institutional memory of the celestial and terrestrial nobility of the archaic world.
Let us also acknowledge the scope of what the research is claiming, because I think it is important to be honest about how extraordinary these claims are. The author is proposing that this writing system was in use on every continent before 1800 BC, and that the iconographic record begins as early as 77,000 BC.
Yes, and the research is candid about the implications. The author writes that he is more than aware of what he is claiming, and that the scope of the discovery is so massive it requires the dedicated efforts of a generation to complete. He estimates that in the British Isles alone there are over 3 million artifacts in national collections. At 5 minutes per artifact, he calculates he would need to work for 150 years just to complete a first pass. This is explicitly framed as a perspective analysis, a demonstration of the importance of the narratives emerging from the iconographic record, not a conclusive statement.
Which is an important distinction. The research is not claiming to have solved ancient history. It is claiming to have found a method, a key, that could unlock it.
Precisely. And the method itself is grounded in something verifiable, the astronomical data. The research repeatedly invites astronomers to task their software to the specific conjunctions and eclipse patterns documented in the iconography. If the Battersea Helm is encoding real positional data about the moon's conjunctions with the sun over Britain, that is testable. If the Lunula of Regan is encoding the composite eclipse dataset from 3 observatories at specific latitudes, those latitudes are recoverable. The research is not asking for faith. It is asking for investigation.
And the author's background is worth noting here. He is a United States Army veteran, a Soviet studies major, and by his own description, a 3-time high school dropout who eventually earned a college degree. He is not an academic archaeologist. He is someone who stumbled onto this in a museum in Cardiff in 2011 and spent over a decade following the thread.
And the research is very deliberate about that framing. He publishes as an unknown soldier, specifically to credit the United States Armed Forces with the training, particularly in surveying and cartography, that made the discovery possible. The method of soloromancy that the research describes, using a staff and the sun's shadow to establish a precise east-west line and measure azimuths to distant landmarks, is, he notes, the very method the U.S. Army taught him in basic training. Moses on Mount Sinai was doing the same thing.
That is a genuinely lovely connection. The oldest cartographic technique in the world still being taught to soldiers in the 21st century.
And the research uses that connection to make a broader point about continuity. The iconographic writing system did not disappear because it was replaced by something better. It was obscured by time, by conquest, by the reduction of complex compositions to what we now call art or mythology. The author's argument is that we have been walking past constitutional documents in museums for 2 centuries, cataloging them as aesthetic objects, and missing everything they were actually saying.
So when you step back from everything we have covered today, the Maasai shield, the Norse brooches, the Battersea helm, the lunula of Regan, the triskelion of the Isle of Man, what is the single thread that runs through all of it?
The thread is this: the sun and the moon were not worshipped in the archaic world in the way we tend to imagine. They were used. They were the clock, the calendar, the political directory, and the constitutional framework of every realm. The celestial nobility, those whose stations were inherited, regarded as eternal, were encoded in solar and lunar iconography because their authority was understood to be as permanent and as observable as the sun and moon themselves. The terrestrial nobility, appointed, mortal in their titles, were the responsive layer beneath, and the entire system was calibrated to the ecliptic, to the conjunction of sun and moon, as the moment when duality resolved into unity.
And that structure, conservative and elevated above, progressive and responsive below, is still with us.
In the House of Lords and the House of Commons, in the Senate and the House of Representatives, in every bicameral legislature that distinguishes between a body of inherited or appointed wisdom and a body of elected responsiveness. The research argues we did not invent these structures. We inherited them. And the iconographic record is the proof of that inheritance, written in solar arcs and lunar crescents on shields and brooches and helms that we have been calling art for far too long.
Here is what this really comes down to, I think. The research by an unknown soldier is not asking us to accept a single extraordinary claim. It is asking us to accept a method, a way of reading objects we thought we understood, and then follow that method wherever it leads. And where it leads, if the research is right, is to a picture of the archaic world that is vastly more sophisticated, more connected, and more politically coherent than anything in the current academic consensus.
And the stakes of getting this right are not trivial. If the iconographic record is what the research claims it is, a globally consistent writing system encoding astronomical data, political constitutions, and territorial maps, then the majority of the 3 million artifacts in British national collections alone are primary source documents for a civilization we have never properly read. Marine archaeology in freshwater lakes, as the research notes, could be a bonanza. The locations of ancient observatory sites are recoverable from the iconography. The political geography of realms that predate written history is encoded in objects sitting in museum cases right now.
And the research is explicit that this is a first interpretation, a prospective analysis, not a final word. The author is inviting peer review, inviting astronomers to test the eclipse data, inviting archaeologists to follow the coordinates embedded in the iconography. It is, in the best sense, an open question.
Which is exactly the right posture for a discovery of this scale. The author writes that future generations will complete the work we begin with this discovery. And I think that is the honest framing. What the research has done is demonstrate that the question is worth asking, that the method works, that the correlations are real, and that the implications are significant enough to warrant serious investigation.
We began this episode with a Maasai warrior raising his shield. And I want to end there too. Because if the research is right, if that shield is simultaneously a sundial, a political constitution, a solar calendar, and a record of the celestial and terrestrial nobility of a realm that predates recognized civilization, then the question that lingers is not about the Maasai, it is about everything else. Every museum in the world is full of objects we have labelled as art, as ritual objects, as decorative artifacts. And the research is asking, what if we have been wrong about all of them? What if we have been standing in front of libraries calling them galleries?
The author's own phrase is the one I keep returning to. He writes, "We are a long way from naked apes groveling for tubers. We are clearly confronted by a literate and technologically advanced civilization. The iconographic record is there. It has always been there. We just needed a method to read it."
Next time you are in a museum, look at the objects differently, not as art, as documents, as constitutions, as astronomical daysets encoded in bronze and gold and stone by people who are tracking the sun and the moon with a precision that still has the capacity to astonish. That is the invitation the research is making.